Everyday Samurai, Episode 65. Greetings, friends, and welcome to Everyday Samurai, in service to your liberty and the security of a free state. How do you do? You know, I've been saying a lot to myself with increasing frequency to embrace the paradox. There are so many things that appear to be contradictory. Have you ever heard of the Stockdale paradox? Admiral Jim Stockdale was a pilot in Vietnam that got shot down and found himself in an enemy prisoner of war camp. And later on, as he gave interviews about his experience, one of the things that was very striking about his account was when he was asked who were the people that were not able to survive under harsh and desolate conditions. And he said that was easy. It's the optimists. Those that believed that things were going to improve were easily shattered when the reality of the situation would hit them. Nowadays, we call this hopium. And in fact, I've read some articles by folks that work in Army psychological operations, and that one of the tactics is to give people a false hope. It's part of a long-term demoralization strategy. And it's also a very basic tenet of the principles of war that you could find in Sun Tzu, where he says you bait people, you offer them something, and then know that they're going to pursue that rather than the thing that would actually advance their cause. It's another manifestation of what was seen during the QAnon phenomena, where somehow messages were being placed that people should just trust the plan without actually seeing the plan. This is all part of that paradoxical nature of existence, what our friends in the ninja community would call Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho, or the alternating appearances of falsehood and reality. When you give someone hope that turns out to be but ash, then their moral foundation is shattered. They lose hope, and they're easy to be manipulated at that point. So the reason I bring this up is to think about how many things out there are false hope, especially in the realm of politics, like voting a certain personality into office is going to somehow overcome the structural problems that are leading to dysfunction. The hope of democracy, which is nothing other than mob rule, as Benjamin Franklin is known to have said that democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for dinner. The whole notion of democracy has supplanted the idea of limited government that is focused on only things of a public nature, res publica, the public thing. So when you supplant in the minds of people, democracy is somehow the equivalent of self-government, that makes them that much more manipulable. Democracy is but a soft form of communism. It is mob rule. And no one can be secure in their persons, houses, papers, or effects under democracy, in the same way that no one can be secure in their persons, houses, papers, or effects under socialism, because socialism presumes that all property is subject to a central plan. Central planning is anathema to private property, individual interests, and individual rights. Now, securing a free state requires resources. That's a different matter. Amassing sufficient force in terms of materiel and personnel can be done in the same way that corporations can accumulate capital and deploy it in skillful ways in order to, number one, protect their interests, number two, perpetuate their business formation, and number three, create value for others. They have to do that through rational economic calculation. Very, very different from centralized planning under political auspices, which is why, as a political economist, I say that political activity needs to be economized. We do that through rational economic calculation. What's required for that is private property and free markets for the exchange thereof. Only then, when people are voting with their quote-unquote dollars, even though the dollar is not a very reliable standard these days, but the point is, when people are able to choose who their protective agency might be, rather than being submitted to a monopoly where there is no choice, that monopoly will essentially become corrupt. It is inescapable that the socialist production of anything, especially security, will lead to suboptimal outcomes. So people need to be free to choose who their protector will be. Provision of security and justice needs to also be subjected to market forces, and the market being the sum total of all individual choices on preferences of goods and services. And Security and justice, too, needs to be subjected to those market disciplines of profit and loss. Governance needs to be kept as local as possible and move more and more closer to a explicit contract. If you look back in history, this is also a paradox. As Henry Sumner Maine once observed, the greatest advance in legal theory was the move from status to contract, meaning no longer do we just believe in a divine right of kings to rule and to set the price of what their rulership will cost the peasants, starting all the way back to Anglo-Saxon law and the dooms of Ethelred, and then evolving through the Magna Carta and other charter documents that set rules between noble families about leadership and responsibilities. It has been an advancement towards a greater specificity in the contract for governance services. And the Constitution is one of the greatest, most illustrative vehicles for contractual government. Even despite its flaws, it is an evolution in this concept of moving from status to contract. The samurai house was also of the same nature, meaning there were specific responsibilities between lord and liege, and the samurai clan operated as a quasi-corporate entity. So democracy is very different than this whole notion of equality under a common law. And in fact, democracy is very detrimental to equality, because democracy, just like socialism, will always require specialists that will have the reins and get to decide how the law is administered. It's inherently oligarchical. So this is very paradoxical to believe that democracy means self-rule, because when you look at things objectively and drill down into the details, there's always specific people that have control over resources and get to dictate the terms upon everyone else. On the surface, it's the politicians and the bureaucrats that make up the state apparatus. But in reality, those people are dancing to the tune of oligarchs that are pulling strings behind the scene. This is why we need to apply those martial principles like what Miyamoto Musashi wrote in the Gorin no Sho, or Book of Five Rings, to become aware of what is not obvious. Look behind the scenes. Look for the causative root elements and the relationships that are driving the dynamics of a situation. So looking beyond the surface explanation and certainly dispelling all notions of democracy being self-government. They are not equivalent terms. And in fact, those that are pushing the whole threat to our democracy nonsense are engaged in a deception operation, which leads us back to that Stockdale paradox. We need to have hope, but not a false hope. We need to recognize that hope is also part of a psychological operation to control and to lull people into a false sense of security when in fact they should be engaging in direct action to decentralize political power and enforce that contract called the Constitution that limits all politicians and bureaucrats to only operating upon delegated authority, res publica, the public thing. Because all human action is predicated upon hope, a hope of improving conditions for themselves. And it all takes place within the human mind. This is one of the insights of praxeology, or the study of human action, which is inherent to sound political economic theory. In order to take action, one must first conceive of an improved condition, recognizing that means are available for achieving with a decent probability of success. Otherwise, no action would ever take place. Think about it in your own life, in the very simplest of things. Even if you are laying in bed and have an itch, you recognize that you would feel better if you scratch that itch. You have the resources available in your physical body to move your arm and hand and scratch the itch. Thus, you will feel better. And then, and only then, do you take action. Multiply that into the wider sphere of all of your activities, and you recognize that hope is essential to all human action, yet it's got to be grounded in truth. It has to be rooted in reality, and the means of achievement need to actually have a viable path forward, which leads to the need to always be questioning things. This is the scientific method, to be skeptical in your inquiry, asking, how do I know that to be true? What if it's not true? What are the alternative competing theories and analysis to discern truth? And this is the way to move from false hope or fool's hope into authentic hope, the type of value-added action that comes from conceiving of a better way of doing things, while also being highly cognizant of the potential pitfalls along the path. There's a book out by Jim Collins called Good to Great that goes into a lot of business cases and examines actual results compared to the false hopes and promises of flamboyant CEOs with grandiose plans. And it turns out that the real way to move from good to great is by having daily discipline, taking care of the little details and being consistent in making micro adjustments and improvements from day to day is the way of accumulating great merit. And this is true in business and in every area of life, which is why if you train in a samurai-related martial art, that you practice those fundamental skills on a daily basis. We have to do our suburi, repeated striking practice with the sword, daily meditation. Even on days where you don't go to the dojo, you are doing your preparatory exercises to keep the body limber and to wring out stress. And also making choices in terms of hydration and nutrition. Remember, you lose weight at the table and gain strength in the gym. You develop skill in the dojo and maintain situational awareness through meditation. These are the daily disciplines of the warrior, and they are just as true today as they were during the age of the samurai or any other warrior tradition. It's the daily disciplines that make the difference, and not falling for the false promises of hopium. And in this way, we develop those faculties of discernment that are so necessary for cutting through the delusion and the deliberate obfuscations that are taking place all around us, whether it be promises of quick riches or promises of government-provided security. Remember, we the people are the government, not the politicians and the bureaucrats, not the captured regulatory agencies, and certainly not the oligarchs that are pulling the string. We the people are the government. And the way to arrest those corrupt ambitions of those that would use the governmental apparatus for their own benefit at the expense of everyone else is by executing the law, repelling invasions, and suppressing insurrections, which is a constitutional duty of every able-bodied citizen. And for that reason, we the people must be organized, armed, and disciplined. And for that reason further, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But of course, those key institutions are missing from the current political configuration, and that is why there is so much crime and corruption rampant in society. So we must embrace the paradox that to be free, we must use collective action. To get rid of the falsehoods and false promises, the hopium put out by politicians and the mockingbird media and all the other institutions out there that are captured and simply advocates of state power, we must come together as a aggregate. So it's not individualism versus collectivism. Those two are falsehoods. In order for individuals to enjoy the blessings of liberty, to be secure in their person, papers, houses, and effects, in other words, private property, they must engage in collective action. Again, liberty is not a concept for an isolated individual living in the wilderness or on a deserted island. Liberty is about how people can live together peaceably and enjoy the benefits of civilization. Creating value for one another is how we become wealthy. That is one of the lessons of political economy. Being alone and having to rely upon one's own labor and one's own resources is a very poor life indeed. We are social creatures. The whole idea of liberty is so that people can enjoy relatively peaceful interactions with one another and also benefit from the division of labor. Yet there are those that cannot abide by a universal standard of law and justice, meaning everyone owns themselves and everyone owns the fruits of their labor. And the only way to become wealthy is through trading with others. If there was a universal standard of justice, and we know what that is, it's property-centric. Do all you have agreed to do. Do not encroach upon other people or their property. And with that, we have the basis of contract and criminal torts. Torts being the method by which people that are violated become whole again. Rather than throwing violators into prison where they stop being productive, the tort system means that they must make their victims whole through compensation. In order to compensate, they therefore must be productive and pay them in some way. So this whole notion of crime and punishment in today's political configuration is distorted, and it leads to even more perverse results. And I got to see it firsthand in my law enforcement and military careers, which is what led me to ask questions, fundamental questions with a scientific lens to say, why are things so messed up? What is the true essence of justice? And it's certainly not what politicians and bureaucrats write down to become legislation and regulation. That's part of the problem. And they will continue to perpetuate the problem so long as questions of law and justice are left in the hands exclusively of politicians and bureaucrats to make rules that benefit themselves and their oligarchical masters. And it's only through we the people individually organized, armed, trained, and ready to contribute to the maintenance of a free society by collectively engaging in that execution of law, repelling invasions and suppressing insurrection. And it doesn't matter what the quote unquote form of government is, that is really just superficial noise. Doesn't matter if it's a democracy or a republic or a monarchy or any other name that you might call it. What really matters is the status of private property. And for that, you need a cultural outlook of respect for private property and the free exchange thereof, and a respect in those justice institutions that bring about restitution by enforcing contracts and remunerating victims through tort. But that is not the world that we live in, so we must indeed embrace the paradox. We do that through our daily discipline, and also maintaining an open outlook, recognizing Kyojitsu Kan Ho, the alternating appearances of falsehood and reality. And we have that power all by our own outlook, our own mental capacity. We do that through training. The way is in training, daily training in those basic disciplines, which is why I recommend a daily meditation practice. I did a video on square breathing, which I highly recommend folks check out. Do a YouTube search or go on my website, everydaysamurai.life, and search for Breathe Like a Samurai. And you want to take that to the next level, I recommend Brain Shot, everydaysamurai.life/shots or Brain Shot. Either URL will take you there. But you use that power of your mind and the enhanced technology of binaural beat entrainment to bring the hemispheres of your brain into a harmonious synchronicity where you access the deeper faculties of mind. So you're doing your square breathing while listening to this brainwave entrainment, and set your mind into that space where you access the higher powers of brain function, of perception, of alternating your present state for an improved state of mind. This is part of that daily discipline. And then that empowers you to look at life with greater clarity, to see through illusion, and to move in a state where you are more resourceful to tackle life's challenges. Highly recommend it. And it can be 15, 20, 30 minutes, whatever you have time for. The breathing, the mindset, the observing your thoughts and watching them arise and subside without attachment, without aversion, and then also noticing how that affects you physiologically. Greater awareness is the key. A daily meditation practice is the way, and Brain Shots empower you with greater technology. So check out everydaysamurai.life/brain shots. That's everydaysamurai.life/brain shot. Now, switching gears, we'll return to chapter 4 of Dr. Edwin Vieira's By Tyranny Out of Necessity, the Bastardy of Martial Law. We're looking at actual bureaucratic generated documents by the U.S. Army and other elements of the U.S. military establishment, and what are the justifications by which they would implement martial law in the United States. We've already seen through previous readings that the political establishment would consider any resistance to their corrupt policies as justification for imposing even more crackdowns upon we the people. And they would do that using this national army, which constitutionally shouldn't even exist, but for 2 years at a time. It's been since 1947 that the military-industrial congressional complex has been in high gear, enriching a certain elite at the expense of the taxpayers in terms of not only money and the money that's being depleted through debasement, but also at the costs of liberty. And we've talked about this in the past, that there's really no such thing as the deep state. It's just that the longer the state exists, the deeper it gets. You can think in conspiratorial terms, and that's certainly true. People that breathe together conspire. People that are working together for their own mutual interests at the expense of others are conspiring. But that really doesn't help when it comes to political matters, because, of course, all legislation and regulation that favors certain beneficiaries at the expense of others is corrupt. It's conspiratorial. People working together for their own mutual benefits at the expense of everyone else. That's one of the features of a permanent state. As we reflect upon Friedrich Bastiat's work in political economy, it's a very matter-of-fact statement that the state is the great fiction by which everyone tries to live at the expense of everyone else. That in and of itself indicates a conspiracy. Yet the lesson to learn through the study of political economy is that type of behavior makes everyone net poorer. And we're seeing the end of the American empire on the horizon due to that corruption, the undermining of law and the debasement of the currency and spending at the expense of everyone to benefit the few is inherently problematic, and things that cannot go on forever won't. Enacting martial governance is simply a means by which those that are holding the reins desperately try to maintain that control for as long as they can. Regardless of how illegitimate it might be, how unconstitutional it might be, that doesn't mean that the powers that shouldn't be won't devise every scheme imaginable to maintain their position for as long as they can. Yet there is a solution. It's always been available to every American, if only we, the people, would drop the illusions and start recognizing the power that we have within ourselves and as chartered by the supreme law of the land. This is why it requires daily discipline to see through illusion, through meditation, through discernment, through constantly asking why, how, and using the scientific method of conjecture and refutation through continual skeptical inquiry and looking for root causes. So here we go. Now we're the scenario posited above to develop into a true uprising on the part of we the people as a whole. The people in at least some areas would surely organize themselves in well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people trained to arm, according to the traditional American understanding, notwithstanding that in so defending their sovereignty, the people, one, would be acting under the aegis of the Second Amendment to provide themselves with the security of a free state. Two, would be empowered by the Constitution to execute the laws of the Union to that end. And three, would be under a supreme duty perforce of the Declaration of Independence to throw off a rogue government, which had perpetrated a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably to the same object, which evinced a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. Nevertheless, in the eyes of the rogue officials of that very rogue government, they would be nothing more than rebels to be subjected to the law of war as belligerents. As members of a militia, such belligerents who were captured would be considered prisoners of war if they met certain qualification. And here he's going to quote from U.S. Army FM Field Manual 27 Tac 10. Prisoners of war are persons belonging to one of the following categories who have fallen into the power of the enemy. 1. Members of the armed forces of a party to the conflict, as well as members of militias or volunteer corps forming part of such armed forces. 2. Members of other militias and members of other volunteer corps, including those of organized resistance movements belonging to a party to the conflict and operating in or outside their own territory, even if this territory is occupied, provided that such militias or volunteer corps, including such organized resistance movement, fulfill the following conditions. A. That of being commanded by a person responsible for his subordinate. B. That of having a fixed distinctive sign recognizable at a distance. C. That of carrying arms openly. D. That of conducting their operations in accordance with the laws and customs of war. More specifically, the requirements for a militia are satisfied in the following fashion. A. Command by a responsible person. This condition is fulfilled if the commander of the corps is a commissioned officer of the armed forces, or is a person of position and authority, or if the members of the militia or volunteer corps are provided with documents, badges, or other means of identification to show they are officers, non-commissioned officers, or soldiers, so that there may be no doubt that they are not persons acting on their own responsibly. State recognition, however, is not essential, and an organization may be formed spontaneously and elect its own officers. Here I'm going to move down to the footnote on the bottom of page 78, number 161, where he says this would apply to independent companies, such as were formed in pre-constitutional Virginia when the breakdown of the legislative process resulted in no statute being in force to regulate the militia in that colony, or such as might be raised today, and it would also apply to so-called private militias, even though there would be no standing in actual militia under the Constitution. Remember, militia are inherently governmental institutions. Those that call themselves private militia are not constitutional. They have no standing. In order to be militia, they must be chartered through a political process. Again, we're moving from status to contract, and a more specific contract is even better. The Constitution has left entirely too much room for corruption to sneak in, and the vehicle by which they do that is by ignoring these provisions for militia. The general government is only in charge of that portion of the militia that is called forth. The militia vis-a-vis the United States as a federation of republics are state-level institutions. Now, how the states organize themselves is a matter for state-level constitutions, and then further down to the county, the town, and going even further down to Thomas Jefferson's concept of the ward republic. No more than 100 families, roughly. These types of things are non-existent in today's current political configuration, but that need not necessarily be so. We're trying to add more specificity to the contract for governmental services. The way to decentralize the corrupt deep state of today is to enforce the Constitution as it stands, and then, based on elevations in technological capability, is it feasible to decentralize even further? That we can explore at a later date. But the tools for radical decentralization and local self-governance are already available as part of the supreme law of the land. Hyperfederalism is available right now, if only we the people would execute the law and maintain the security of a free state. Continuing. B. Fixed distinctive sign. The second condition relative to the possession of a fixed distinctive sign, recognizable at a distance, is satisfied by the wearing of military uniform, but less than complete uniform will suffice. A helmet or headdress which would make the silhouette of the individual readily distinguishable from that of an ordinary citizen would satisfy this requirement. It is also desirable that the individual member of the militia or volunteer corps wear a badge or brassard permanently affixed to his clothing. It is not necessary to inform the enemy of the distinctive sign, although it may be desirable to do so in order to avoid misunderstanding. C. Carrying arms openly. This requirement is not satisfied by the carrying of weapons concealed about the person, or if the individuals hide their weapons on the approach of the enemy. D. Compliance with the law of war. This condition is fulfilled if most of the members of the body observe the laws and customs of war, notwithstanding the fact that individual members concerned may have committed a war crime. Members of militia and volunteer corps should be especially warned against employment of treachery, denial of quarters, that is, not showing mercy, maltreatment of prisoners of war, wounded and dead, improper conduct towards flags of truce, pillage, and unnecessary violence and destruction. If we the people could not or did not organize themselves in formal militia, they could nonetheless conduct an armed uprising in the form of a levy en masse. If the enemy approaches an area for the purpose of seizing it, the inhabitants, if they defend it, are entitled to the rights of regular combatants as a levy en masse, although they wear no distinctive sign. In such a case, all the inhabitants of the area may be considered legitimate enemies until the area is taken. Should some inhabitants of a locality thus take part in its defense, it might be justifiable to treat all of the males of military age as prisoners of war. Even if inhabitants who formed the levy en masse lay down their arms and return to their normal activities, they may be made prisoners of war. Prisoners of war are persons belonging to one of the following categories who have fallen into the power of the enemy. Inhabitants of a non-occupied territory who, on the approach of the enemy, spontaneously take up arms to resist the invading forces, without having had time to form themselves into regular armed units, provided they carry arms openly and respect the laws and customs of war. Observe that under these circumstances, all of the inhabitants of the region might be considered legitimate enemies and made prisoners of war, but only if they respected the laws and customs of war. On the other hand, persons such as guerrillas and partisans who take up arms and commit hostile acts without having complied with the conditions prescribed by the laws of war for recognition as belligerents are, when captured by the injured party, not entitled to be treated as prisoners of war and may be tried and sentenced to execution or imprisonment. This emphasizes the vital importance of having we the people always properly organized in formal militia, according to constitutional principles, in anticipation of the possibility that they might someday need to confront rogue officials in the field with martial force. For if patriots arrayed in arms against such officials but not organized within any actual militia did not comply with the conditions prescribed by the laws of war by recognition as belligerents, precisely because they rightfully refuse to recognize the status of belligerents as legitimately applicable to them under the Constitution, when and for the reason that their opponents were proceeding in violation of the Constitution. Then, when captured by those rogue officials, the patriots would not be entitled to be treated as prisoners of war and might be tried and sentenced to execution or imprisonment. Yet, if they did comply with the conditions and thereby arguably acquiesced in the status of belligerents as prescribed by the laws of war, even though the status could not be imposed upon them under the Constitution, they would arguably waive or otherwise forfeit various of their constitutional rights, thus affording rogue officials an excuse not to honor those rights. In any event, in whatever states we the people succeeded in formally revitalizing one or more of the militias of the several states, the rules of the laws of war as to a levy en masse and guerrillas and partisans would be of little or no relevance, because a properly organized militia would be indistinguishable in terms of its inclusiveness from a levy en masse, and such near universal membership would preclude as a practical matter the formation of significant numbers of irregular units, but they might apply to some inhabitants of a locality who were too old or too young or not sufficiently able-bodied to be enrolled in any militia unit, but who nonetheless took up arms spontaneously in the locality's defense. And if the militia were not revitalized, these rules would likely reach those patriots who did not have time to form ad hoc militia, or who were too few in number to constitute a true levy en masse, but nevertheless did stand up in arms against their oppressors. Whatever circumstances prevailed, potentially the entire disaffected population in the area, actively opposed to rogue officials' military and paramilitary forces, would be exposed to being prisoners of war, and as such they could be dispatched to camps for indefinite internment, presumably for the duration of the quote-unquote war. Even though not captured with arms in their hands, other patriots would not be much better off. According to the laws of war, an individual in an occupied territory who were not a member of the militia or not among a levy en masse, but who committed acts hostile to the occupant or prejudicial to its security, would not be entitled to be treated as a prisoner of war, but instead would be considered a protected person who had engaged in conduct hostile to the opposing belligerent, even as a protected person. However, such an individual would be exposed to harsh controls. And this next section comes from Field Manual 27, Tac 10, where in the territory of a party to the conflict, the latter is satisfied that an individual protected person is definitely suspected of or engaged in activities hostile to the security of the state. Such individual persons shall not be entitled to claim such rights and privileges as would, if exercised in the favor of such individual person, be prejudicial to the security of such state. In each case, such persons shall nevertheless be treated with humanity, and in case of trial shall not be deprived of the rights of fair and regular trial. They shall also be granted the full rights and privileges of a protected person at the earliest date consistent with the security of the state or occupying power, as the case may be. But what the laws of wars consider being treated with humanity would have its limits. Persons who, without having complied with the conditions prescribed by the laws of war for recognition as belligerents, commit hostile acts about or behind the lines of the enemy, are not to be treated as prisoners of war and may be tried and sentenced to execution and imprisonment. Such acts include, but are not limited to, sabotage, destruction of communications facilities, intentionally misleading troops by guides, liberation of prisoners of war, and certain other acts. Protected persons who commit an offense which is solely intended to harm the occupying power, but which does not constitute an attempt on the life or limb of members of the occupying forces or administration, nor a grave collective danger, nor seriously damage the property of the occupying forces or administration or the installations used by them, shall be liable to internment or simple imprisonment, provided the duration of such internment or imprisonment is proportionate to the offense committed. Furthermore, internment or imprisonment shall, for such offenses, be the only measure adopted for depriving protected persons of liberty. The penal provisions promulgated by the occupying power may impose the death penalty on a protected person only in cases where the person is guilty of espionage or serious acts of sabotage against the military installations of the occupying power, or of intentional offenses which have caused the death of one or more persons, provided that such offenses were punishable by death under the law of the occupied territory in force before the occupation began. Reservation as to death penalty: the United States has reserved the right to impose the death penalty without regard to whether the offenses are punishable by death under the laws of the occupied territory at the time the occupation begins." Close quote. So, if rogue officials, military or paramilitary forces occupied a part of the United States in which the death penalty were prohibited by the laws of either particular states or the United States, including the Constitution's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishments, these forces could nonetheless impose the death penalty. Beyond that, as with prisoners of war, if the occupying power considers it necessary for imperative reasons of security to take safety measures concerning protected persons, it may at most subject them to assigned residence or to internment, thus acts in violation of the laws promulgated by the occupying power, which are not solely intended to harm that power, as for example traveling without a permit or violating exchange control regulations, are also punishable by internment or imprisonment or other penalties depriving the protected person of liberty. Did you hear that? Traveling without a permit or violating exchange control regulations. That right there is a violation of constitutional order. And this is what martial law would look like. This is baked into their operating manual. Continuing. So, for all sorts of reasons, the ostensibly protected inhabitants of an occupied area could be subjected to the conditions euphemistically described today as shelter in place, lockdown, or house arrest. So, for all sorts of reasons, the ostensibly protected inhabitants of an occupied area could be subjected to the conditions euphemistically described today as shelter in place, lockdown, or house arrest, under which they would be allowed to remain in that particular territory only as virtual prisoner. Remember, he wrote this book in 2015. Think about all of the lockdowns and house arrests and traveling without permit conditions that people all over the world were subjected to under the Charlie 19er pandemic declarations. Or they could be transported, perhaps over long distances, to the types of displaced persons camps, resettlement and internment camps, concentration camps, and work camps that totalitarian states established during the 20th century. As with the general population, martial governance would clamp down on the entirety of the territory which rogue military and paramilitary forces occupied. Now, military occupation is a question of fact. It presupposes a hostile invasion, resisted or unresisted, as a result of which the invader has rendered the invaded government incapable of publicly exercising its authority, and that the invader has successfully substituted its own authority for that of the legitimate government in the territory invaded. Therefore, that territory is considered occupied when it's actually placed under the authority of the hostile army. The occupation extends only to the territory where such authority has been established and can be exercised. In particular, belligerent occupation must be both actual and effective. That is, the organized resistance must have been overcome, and the force in possession must have taken measures to establish its authority. It is sufficient that the occupying force can, within a reasonable time, send detachments of troops to make its authority felt within the occupied district. Their mere existence of local resistance groups does not render the occupation ineffective. After all, no conquering army occupies the entire territory conquered. Its authority is established when it occupies and holds securely the most important places, and when there is no opposing governmental authority within the territory. The inability of any other power to establish and maintain governmental authority therein is the test. On the other hand, small raiding parties or flying columns, reconnaissance detachments, or patrols moving through an area cannot be said to occupy it. Occupation is invasion plus taking firm possession of enemy territory for the purpose of holding it. And by definition, occupation to be effective must be maintained. In case the occupant evacuates the district or is driven out by the enemy, the occupation ceases. Nor does the existence of a rebellion or the activity of guerrilla or paramilitary units of itself cause the occupation to cease, provided the occupant could, at any time it desired, assume physical control of any part of the territory. If, however, the power of the occupant is effectively displaced for any length of time, its position towards the inhabitants is the same as before occupation. The theory of martial governance today is that rogue officials may deploy military and paramilitary forces anywhere within the United States in order to impose law and order. The assumption of the Homeland Security establishment is that sufficient forces are available to set up any time and to maintain at all times martial governance in any and every state and locality, even in the face of a sizable rebellion or the activity of guerrilla or paramilitary units. Given that theory and that belief, one must wonder whether those officials imagine that they have already occupied this country in principle and are merely awaiting the excuse to occupy it in practice. With that, I will conclude this reading of Chapter 4 from Dr. Edwin Vieira's By Tyranny Out of Necessity, The Bastardy of Martial Law. And that final paragraph does give us something to contemplate. Do those that hold public office, regardless of their wanton violation of constitutional principles and order, consider the United States to be occupied by them? I'll leave you to contemplate that and also think about some of the public statements made by public officials where they taunt those that would hold the Second Amendment as inviolate, stating that there's no way regular citizens armed with AR-15s could take on military forces with F-15s and nuclear weapons. How arrogant of a statement. Not only does it completely betray the fact that they have abused their position and think that they are invincible, going back to our discussion of hopium, but it also betrays the fact that they don't see citizens as the sovereigns. They see themselves, the public office holders, as the ones who are quote-unquote the government. And unfortunately, entirely too many people have been brainwashed into believing that only those holding public office are the government. Just take a read at the U.S. Constitution. Take a read at the Declaration of Independence. It is the right and duty of people to alter or abolish the form of government whenever it becomes destructive of the ends for which it was constituted. We, the people, are the government, according to the Constitution. We delegate certain limited authorities to public office holders for limited durations of time to perform specific actions for the public good. Again, res publica, not democracy, because the mob is fickle. The mob can be easily manipulated because they're weak in the mind. The way is in training. Daily individual actions as well as collective actions to be organized, armed, and disciplined, and also have a theory of what law should be. And then wake up to the fact that politicians and bureaucrats are not the government. We, the people, are the government. The form of government includes politicians and bureaucrats, but ultimately sovereignty rests with we, the people. And to restore constitutional order requires that we, the people, execute the laws and make those politicians and bureaucrats dependent upon we, the people, to execute the law. And only then will we have true self-governance. But that, again, begins with individual choices, embracing the paradox, and then following through with those daily disciplines that help us move from good to great. Friends, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Everyday Samurai and look forward to seeing you next time. If you like what you've heard here, please give us a like. Be sure to subscribe and share the show with a friend. I've said before, and I hope you do, consider moving your podcast listening to the Fountain app and embracing also the Bitcoin lifestyle. Recognize that gold and silver are constitutional money, not Federal Reserve notes. Paper is poison. If you don't hold it, you don't own it, and that's the problem with gold and silver. I have gold that I've never seen, but for a computer screen. Bitcoin is something that you can own. It is the future. It's not too late. It is exponential wealth building technology. And the Fountain app is a great way to listen to your podcasts and also getting into the Bitcoin economy. So I highly recommend it. Think about your komebitsu, the rice box that is your collective wealth, and think in terms of generational wealth that you can pass on because the money is not being debased by politicians and bureaucrats. That's the type of long-term thinking that we need. And that is akin to building the wealth of the samurai house or the clan. It's not just about you. It's about preserving wealth and leaving a legacy. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and posterity, we need to take these daily disciplinary actions and build that community of enlightened warriors that are willing to secure a free state. So until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and be well.